Hi, this is Paula Scaffidi from Fiberella.com. I enjoy creating mini landscapes with natural color bridges. The real fascination for me lies in the color mixing. How you can gather together bits of color tiny enough for the eye to mix and concentrations of color in other areas to counterbalance those blended areas. It's not like mixing dyes together or blending paints with a brush. In textiles, we have other ways to do that. Here are three of the accessory feet I most often use for color blending in mini landscapes. The number 12 foot has a nice tunnel underneath. You should fill the tunnel. The foot works best when you basically fill up that guide with maybe a large piece of yarn or a few smaller ones that have been twirled together. Perhaps included a thin strip of fabric into that twirled linear embellishment. You can even use bits of roving or unspun fiber, splitting a length of fiber into a thin log and twirling that a tiny bit. Whatever kinds of linear materials you put in there, a gentle twist and the combination of that with the stitch pattern that you're laying on top of it will couch or fasten it to the base. The 21 foot I prefer over the 12 foot when I'm going to be sewing in pathways that have tight curves. The built-in guide makes it impossible for you to drive off the embellishment. Just floss your linear embellishment back and forth a little bit, making sure that it flows freely through the foot and at the same time, once again, kind of fills up the guide. The foot off on the right is an applique foot. It was designed with some extra space in back, so that if you were, for example, putting a satin stitch around the edge of fabric, an applique shape onto a base, you'd have plenty of headroom underneath that foot for the satin stitch. Well, it also makes it ideal to drive this foot over lots of texture, and you'll see in the next slide why the clarity of the foot is so important to me. There's an exception to kind of filling up the tunnel in that number 12 foot. Whenever using eyelash yarn, as pictured in the lower left, I like these wispy ends of the eyelash yarn to stay free and to stand up off the artwork. And if you had placed it inside the guide on the 21 foot, you'd end up stitching over all the eyelash and lose that effect. Here you can see the eyelash yarn couched down with that number 12 foot. The color of the thread I'm using matches fabric elsewhere in the artwork and is a little brighter green than the base fabric in the location of the eyelash yarn. So in a way, it not only changes the bluish gray color of the eyelash to have a more green feel to it, it also brightens up that green area of the artwork. Your eye tends to blend little bits of color when they're in small quantities. So here you can see that visibility on the 23 foot. If I wanted that peachy color, light orange thread that's in the needle, if I wanted it to have a stronger effect over the blue, well, I could shorten the stitch length, I could widen the stitch, and throw more thread on top of the blue yarn. So I just love that as I sew, I can peer through and see how much of an effect is the current thread color having on its base, and adjust according to how I feel about it. I might sew a little ways and then make it so that the thread color is much more pungent, and then change my stitch settings to have a more effect. Here's a tiny little zigzag. It's slightly brighter than the embellishment. I loved the edges that were built into this flat knitting yarn. Had a great little picot edge. So I decided to just let those edges lift up off of the base and just attach it with this teeny tiny, slightly different color zigzag. Whenever you stitch on top of something, you're actually changing the color of it. It's not all that different from mixing paints. What was a green yarn is now more of a lime green yarn. And because of the thread wrapping over this very loosely spun yarn, there's some nice bumps and texture along the way. The tinier the piecing, the more readily the eye is going to blend it. And I just love getting my nose kind of deep into all these little textures, adding different stitch patterns, different mixes of color. It's important to have some areas where the color remains concentrated. Imagine if you had painted a picture and while the painting was still wet, you blended the entire thing. Well, you'd lose your image. So you want to have some areas that maintain color concentration and other places where you mix together little bits and pieces of those colors. Let's look at what I call stitch glaze in a more abstract way for a moment. What is really happening when you put thread on top of fabric? Well, there's a couple of things going on here. I want to call your eye to something called color dotting. And this is an intentional bringing up of the bobbin thread. While you can put yellow thread in your bobbin when you're doing a landscape, and when you want some sunshine or sunlight or a warmer effect, just tighten up the top tension. Here's a broader example. A decorative stitch was being used and I adjusted the top tension while sewing. The tighter the top tension, the more the yellow bobbin thread came up. You get the idea. The tinier a stitch pattern, the more readily the eye mix it. So let's look at this little segment. Here's a color swatch that roughly matches my base or lilac colored fabric. There's a couple of different values in there, so it's roughly one of those swatches. And photographically, this is the exact same swatch as the first one. It's just larger, it's lower in the format of the slide. And it's much easier to see how the base fabric is one and the same with that big stretch of base fabric. Well, why does it look so much darker or different in the smaller swatch? Take a look at the very center of that small swatch. Did you see a diamond appear? I popped a little diamond like that one into the swatch. Watch that small swatch again. I'm dropping in more of those color chips. And here's the swatch, very, very tiny. The farther away you get from something, the more you squint your eyes, the more blended the colors will appear. So the green thread is really having a bigger impact on the lilac fabric, the tinier the spaces between them. If you squint your eyes really hard, that swatch is going to kind of blend into that neutral. Since lilac and green are not neighbors on the color wheel, you're going to get a lovely neutral color. There's that little pink diamond again. But look how brown it actually is. When I dropped those little chips in, I used a much more brownish color because your eye was blending those colors together. See that? That's the color of the chips. Let me take that out again. Look how bright and light the lilac is. And yet you're seeing something that's more toned because that green thread is getting mixed by eye with the lilac base. A couple of other little tips for creating mini landscapes. It's quite amazing that many of you probably already thought tree. I never said the word tree. I just used a very simple shape and happened to make it green. The power of basic shapes is quite amazing. And if you simply repeat a shape larger, higher up and lower down within the format of your artwork, overlapped, why this one appears closer to you. And off on the right, leaving the format because it seems to go outside the picture. Again, taller than and lower than the original triangles, it appears closer to you. So repetition of shape and changing its scale, overlapping, and where you place it all have an effect on creating depth. So what is the ish factor? The ish is how muted colors look the tinier the bits are. There's my beigey color that the eye mixed from the green and lilac. Now there's a little surprise. I'm going to repeat that. When you first look at the color of that swatch up in here, it seems so brown. And when you look at the swatch down here, the solid area, it looks so pink. Well, what's happening here is this green backdrop is emphasizing its opposite color, pink. But watch where the swatch emanates from. Take a look up here again. That is the identical color, just being affected by its surroundings. So while it's true that color can be a little bit tricky, playing some games on you, the bright side is you can use fewer colors in different proportions in lots of different areas in your artwork to create a beautiful richness of color palette. This last triangle that just popped in is brighter than. That's sometimes called chroma, how bright a color is. This one also happens to be brighter and also a little bit more yellow-green. So the hue changed and the brightness changed. Brighter colors, warmer colors tend to come out at you. Cooler colors tend to recede. And duller colors seem to be farther away. Altogether, adding some things that are brighter, some things that are duller, and some things in between creates richness of color palette. So in textiles, we're not swirling paints together, but this is a fun little thing. You can create a piece of chenille to identify a bridge color. All you need to do is stack up a stack of the same colors and then go ahead and sew on the bias, some little hallways, roughly at the 45-degree diagonal line, the bias line. Mine curved a little. I played some games with it. But basically you're stitching and then you're slicing through all of the layers except the base layer. Don't cut the bottom one because that's what's going to hold the whole thing together. I want you to notice something very quiet here. Take a look at the colors that I chose to use in the background. Those are some of the colors your eye is actually mixing in some of these chenille areas. So I'm going to add 3 little shapes into the chenille just to show you some different proportions. This recent one has a lot of purple showing. The first one had a bit more green in it, and this last one has a lot of green. So depending on how much of which color you're seeing, your eye is going to mix it. And you can even talk about mixing from purple to green in evenly spaced gradation. So here's a chip. It's a little brighter, but it's roughly a purple, and a green chip. And I've gone ahead and created some natural color gradations from green to purple. And some different values of the neutral or natural color bridges that my eye found mixing those 2 hues together. I've just tossed in an abstract shape, a rectangle, a trapezoid, and a slightly curving, basically horizontal line. You may have seen something else. You may have seen a house and a pathway. Again, the power of basic shapes. Use them. They're lots of fun. And by repeating colors from elsewhere in an artwork, and in this case I repeated the color of the PowerPoint slide, it helps create a color harmony within all the colors that are in your view, within that palette. So for the eye to travel smoothly, you want to have nice smooth steps. Your eye should be able to flow right through from color to color. Now, you can create those steps just with bits of thread and bits of embellishment in a mini sketch. But what if you wanted to make a quilt? You might want to have some larger expanses of just the right fabric colors. You don't have to line them up in order in your quilt, but by having them in some kind of a smooth gradation on the cutting table before you begin your patchwork or your imagery, it's helpful because it creates this very smooth way for your eye to travel around the artwork. I like to take and make a little frame with my fingers and take a look at the hardness. I'm going to take that arrow out. The hardness of the line. Does this edge show up to the same degree that this edge shows up? And you can make a little frame between your pointer and your thumb and even close it off with your other hand and just squint and see, when does that edge disappear? How strong an edge is it? And look for that similar strength of edge between all your color fabrics. You can chop up some confetti, and if it was a tiny artwork, you could just sew over that to sew it down. But if you were making a quilt, you could take some of that confetti to your stash and look for a fabric that the confetti disappears into when you squint your eyes. That's how I found the neutral color behind it. So here you see some various bits of fabric. It's interesting to me how bright the emerald green is here, and yet when you stitch some purple thread over it, look how much duller that strip of fabric appears compared to the original green. So there are all these different ways to mix colors, and even down below, again, patching smaller patches will allow the eye to blend fabrics for you. Over on the right, I took some scraps off the cutting table and picked them up with just a piece of clear packaging tape, and then took it into my stash and selected a fabric. It can be that simple. Here's a little piece of chenille that, while it doesn't replicate the fabric, it certainly speaks to it. So have some fun mixing colors. And in this little example, I have other free views for you. I was working on ribbons of color. This is less than 2 inches square. But again, those harmonies, those natural color bridges are often a part of my color work. I hope you enjoyed today. Come back to Fiberella.com, click Create. It's simple, and you'll be linked to other free views as well. Have a wonderful day, and enjoy all the colors of your day.